I'm Ann Landis, originally, then Longbreak, and I'm now Ann Martin. And I grew up in Bristol. I was the youngest of 4 children. My father was John and Marguerite Landis. My mother grew up in Bristol. Her 2 sisters also grew up in Bristol, and my grandma lived here, as did her great-grandfather and grandmother, as did her great-great-grandfather and grandmother. So I've got a long history in Bristol, family-wise. Legend has it, and this is from my family's point of view, that James Nicholson, who was my grandma Martin's maiden name was Nicholson, was the first person that was not a Native American that settled in this area. Now, since then, I've heard other people say the same thing about their ancestors, so who knows. But he's buried in the cemetery behind the museum. And my mother's first cousin erected a tombstone there in his honor, and on that it says that he was the first white settler in Bristol, but who knows. But anyway, he lived here. He came here from Ireland in the early 1728, I think is when he first arrived actually in Bristol. And part of the legend of James Nicholson is that he also is it platted or plated? One or the other. The south side of the river of Bristol. So I've not seen that documented anywhere else, so I don't know how accurate that is. And he also purportedly married Daniel Boone's cousin, Elizabeth Thompson, and I've never seen that documented anywhere else. I have 2 of my children have gone into Ancestry.com, and they've tried to trace some of these legendary stories, and some of them have been well documented, and some of them not so much. But James lived here with Elizabeth, and they had a number of children, one of whose name was George. And apparently George left sometime in through there, because then there's a story that he came back to this area and lived here, built the house on the St. Joe River, which is the greenhouse on the river. And actually, the people that live there now, my son went to high school with their son. So that's a connection. So it's interesting to have always driven by that house and knew I was connected to that house, but then to actually go into it when their son and my son were both visiting here at the same time. We were invited there to dinner, and it was fun to just be in that house. George was married twice, and that was interesting to me because I knew that his first wife was buried in that same cemetery behind the school, but then George is buried at Oak Ridge, which I found through the genealogical section at the History Museum, Elkhart County History Museum. And I thought, well, why would she be buried there and he be buried at Oak Ridge? To discover that actually George's first wife had died before Findlay, my grandma Martin's father, had been born. So apparently George's first wife died, and then he married a person by the name of Eliza Chess. That's an interesting story because Eliza Chess, according to my mother's first cousin, who did a lot of history, was supposedly the first horticulturist in the Midwest. Now, that's another thing I've never seen documented anywhere else, but it's interesting. Bill Nicholson was my mother's cousin that did a lot of the history, and when he documented his family's history, he didn't just document when people were born and when they died, but he documented their occupations because he wanted to see if there was any connection in family histories. And horticulture runs all through my family. In fact, my daughter, her degree is in horticulture and forestry. So that was an interesting thing. So George Nicholson was married to Eliza Chess, and her father was supposedly one of the first horticulturists in the Midwest. This is according to my mom's first cousin, Bill Nicholson, who had done quite a bit of research in the background and followed occupations of different family people. I found that interesting because horticulture definitely runs through my family. Everybody loves gardening, and my daughter actually has a degree in horticulture. And then George had a son named Findlay, and that's my great-grandfather is Findlay Nicholson. He was in Bristol almost all of his life, although he married a woman from Akron, Ohio, so I don't know how that worked. But she was a bit of a character, and but they had 5 children, one of whom was my grandmother. And this is interesting to me too. Apparently the Nicholson family just moved because James was the only one of his family that stayed here. He came with 2 brothers. They went on west or north. And George's brothers all went different directions. I think one went to Michigan and stayed there, but the rest all went onward. And the same with Findlay's brothers and sisters. There's a few that are buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, but most of them went on elsewhere. And then my grandma, whose maiden name was Nicholson, but she was my Grandma Martin, which is also my name, which is another sort of genealogical story that they tell at the end. But she stayed here, but she had one brother that went up to Lapeer, Michigan, and started a nursery. I've stayed in touch with that family, and I asked my second cousin Nan, do you know how Earl ended up in Lapeer? She doesn't. Another went to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Then she had a brother that ended up living in Centerville, Michigan, on the Prairie River there. And then a sister, Tula, that left for a while and then came back. But so my Grandma Martin also spent a lot of time in Bristol as a child growing up here. She lived for a while in the same home that George had lived in, that Findlay then took over. And then she moved to Elkhart and stayed in the Elkhart area, but had a lot of close ties, a lot of close friends here in Bristol. They had a birthday club for a while, and she would come to Bristol for the birthday club, and of course she came and visited a lot. So that takes us up to my mother, who grew up in Bristol all her life, and as did her 2 sisters. My dad grew up in Elkhart, but they met at a filling station one time, both loved to dance, and so that's how they ended up getting together and getting married. But my dad has told me stories about he loved to go to my Grandma Martin's home because they always laughed and had a lot of fun. And his background was pretty Mennonite, and they didn't laugh and play games and have so much fun, although they did love music. So my mom grew up. She was born in 1913, so a lot of her later teenage years were tainted by the Depression that was taking place. And my Grandpa Martin, well, they just moved a lot when she was growing up. They'd rent a house, stay there until the rent ran out, and then they'd move to another house in Bristol and stay there until the rent ran out, and so on. But she loved Bristol. And so then, when she and my dad were married, they moved to Elkhart and lived there for a while, and several other places. Then he went into the Army during World War II, and when he was in the Army during World War II, he was then sent overseas, and he wanted to make sure that my mom, and she had 3 children by then, wanted a stable place, or two and one on the way when he left. For them to live, and so they bought the house where Linda Powell now lives, on the corner of Vestula and Apollo Street in Bristol, Indiana, and that's where I grew up and lived all my life until I left home. I want to tell one interesting story about Findlay. That was my Grandma Martin's father, my great-grandfather. Findlay owned the grocery store, or it was actually a general store, which was, when I was growing up, was King's Grocery Store. And he also helped build the old Condon drugstore, which is across the street from there, that's now been torn down. But he owned that general store, until the Depression of the late 1890s, which I didn't even know there was such a thing, but that's what you learn when you study family history, and that's when he had to give up the proprietorship of that store. Now we're in the. I was born in 1946, and Bristol did not have kindergarten for me. My two older sisters went to kindergarten, but they abandoned it by the time I came along. So I started first grade at Bristol. At that time, everybody K to 12 was in, 1 to 12 was in the same building. And so I spent my first 5 years in that building, and they built the new elementary school. And I went 6th grade there, and then back to the Bristol High School from grade 7 to 12. Had a lot of fun. Had just the cool thing for me growing up in Bristol is everybody could do everything. We were small enough classes, and you could be in a choir. Well, they didn't have girls' sports in those days, but we did have a girls' athletic association. But you could be in choir and band and take all sorts of classes, and we just had fun. I was a town person. I've got good friends that sort of lived out in the country and sort of jealous of all the town people. So growing up in Bristol was just a lot of fun. One of the things that was really nice, everybody felt very safe here. We all had stories to tell, the things we did that were a little bit on the mischievous side, including me. But so you didn't go too far along because you knew your parents were going to find out about most everything you did, because that's just the way Bristol was. Everybody looked out for everybody else. But we'd play softball. Well, we used to play behind the old fire station, which is now moved. But we played ball behind the old fire station, and we'd play till dark. And then when that got changed, we'd go play down behind the school. I was always supposed to be home before dark. Of course, the ball field was out there, no trees or anything around, and then all of a sudden I'd look up at the street and I'd realize, oh dear, the street lights are on, because I had to be home before street lights came on. So I was almost always late, but they forgave me, and they liked who I was with, and so that was fun. And we used to mess around in the old opera house. It had not been turned into Elkhart Civic Theater yet at that point. And of course, we weren't supposed to be in there, but it was so fun, and all the playbills are up there, and it was just so much fun. And then one day, Bill Stutzman was the town marshal at that time. One day he saw that we were in there, and so we saw him coming towards us, so we scurried out the back door and went over and sat on my front porch, which is just catty-cornered across the street from there. And so we didn't fool Bill. He knew exactly what we were doing. We were just sort of twiddling our thumbs like we'd been there all afternoon. And he didn't make us fess up or anything. He just said, you were trespassing, and that's against the law, and please don't do that again. And we said we wouldn't, but of course we did. But we were more careful from then on. But it was just a wonderful, wonderful way to grow up. And so many of the kids lived in town then that it was just easy to get a group together at any time, and we just had a really good time. A lot of us were all in the same activities. We had a Girl Scout troop at that time we'd been together since 2nd grade. The girls' choir, a lot of us went to Bristol United Methodist Church. Well, it was Bristol Methodist Church then, and then it became Bristol United Methodist, and now it's Bristol Community Church. But we all were part of the youth group there, and had wonderful time going up to retreats on Quarry Lake, and the Legion would have hay rides in the fall, and we just had a wonderful way to grow up. We were a small group. I only had 38 in my graduating class, but we became very close. One of the unique things I think about growing up in Bristol was that you can not see somebody for 10 years, sometimes even 20 years. You say, hey, aren't you blah, 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 and yes, yeah. and you'd start talking as if you'd seen each other yesterday. And that's just one of the wonderful things. And then it gets into the, do you remember when? And oh yeah, and then story after story. And it's just cool. One more thing I'll say about growing up in Bristol that sort of breaks my heart. I walk a lot, so when I'm walking around, I look at some of the houses and I remember who lived in them when I was growing up. And gosh, when I was growing up, we had like 3 grocery stores and 2 hardware stores and 4 filling stations and a dime store that had everything in it. But I think one of the very few things that was there when I was growing up is still there is the Redbird. I'm glad the Redbird's still there because it's got a lot of history that goes with it too. It was not well insulated at all, so you could hear mice running up and down the walls all winter long, more than in the summer. And it was also in the summer very, very hot. Now I had the bedroom just off of the attic, so how I would cure that was I'd go out in the attic, which was much hotter than the rest of the house. So when I went back into my bedroom, then it seemed a little cooler. So that's how I conquered that. And of course, had those old-fashioned oscillating fans in the summer nights. So that, and then the basement of that house had it was an old, I think they call it Michigan basement. It was a dirt floor and all rocks around the walls. And then it had a very narrow, I think Linda mentioned it in her story, that went, no, we never knew for sure where it went. I think Linda Pavla owns it now. I think she thinks it could have been part of the Underground Railroad. And I'd like to pursue that sometime to see if there's a way to be able to document that one way or the other. When I was in the 4th grade, I think my parents decided that they needed to build on an addition to the house. My brother was the oldest, and then my 2 older sisters were all in their teens by then and wanted to listen to music and wanted to have fun, pretty noisy, and so that's how the addition on the house came to be. And then my parents also, for the first time in their lives, actually had a pretty private bedroom that they could go to escape everything. And so that was fun, and that was so in the dining room, which is one of the very magical places at Christmas time, there is a cupboard where we kept all of our fine, well, we didn't really have a lot of fine china, but our best china was kept in that cupboard. And the bottom shelves did not have glass in them, but they were other storage items for, like, I think the silver chests were in there. Now on the other side of that cabinet, there was one that was exactly like it. On the bathroom side, the bathroom was right across from our dining room. Our house sort of had a roundabout. You'd go through the dining room into the kitchen, and then to what we call the back room where the washer and dryer were, then into the bathroom. So the bathroom ended up just opposite the dining room, and then into the den and the living room. So what we would do when we were kids, if we knew somebody was using the bathroom, we would stick a broom handle through from the dining room and then jam it, and then the door on the other side would go flying open. And that was that was our modern day television. That's how we entertained ourselves. So yes, that's that's true. But the house itself was just magical at the holiday time. It was just full of lights and music, and Christmas is coming up, so I'll mention this. At Christmas time, all my relatives, I mentioned earlier that my 2 aunts had grown up in Bristol as well, and one aunt lived in Elkhart, and she and her husband, Bob, Gene and Bob Kennedy, Bob also grew up in Bristol, is sort of a legendary basketball player here, and they had 4 kids, and they'd all come every year, and my mom and dad both played piano, and they played piano, and we'd sing Christmas carols. So it wasn't anything about, I don't even think we gave gifts to each other. We just all gathered and ate and sang and laughed, and it was just magical. And sometimes my mom's other sister, who had moved to West Lafayette, she and her husband and kids would come up too, and that was just very, very special. And when we were all there together, we'd usually, if the weather was decent at all, just walk up and down the streets of Bristol, telling stories and laughing and having fun. And it was magical. A lot of times we'd end up walking out to Oak Ridge Cemetery, which is where my great-grandfather Findlay is buried, and George is too. I know, going way back, George is Findlay's father, and interestingly enough, George's second wife and I think one of their children are buried, within, I would say, 300, 400 feet, but it took me forever to find their gravestones because they're all facing the river and not facing the road, and they're off a little bit. So I'm not sure why they did it that way or what that's about. Maybe they wanted to face the water because the creek runs back through there. But I did eventually find them. I looked for them for a long time, and in the meantime, I found a couple other Dickersons. I said I walk a lot, and part of that time, especially in the winter, the town always keeps the cemetery plowed, and so that's the place I know I can go walk and be able to be fairly safe to walk around. It's a lot of history in Oak Ridge Cemetery. A lot of old Bristol names are there, that some of which I recognize and some I don't. So it's always a pleasure to walk there.